Hello, good morning. Here we are again. It's Tuesday. There's a good joke I know about two hippos in a swamp. One says to the other, I keep thinking it's Wednesday. That's it, that's the whole joke. But it isn't, it's Tuesday. And we're here for chapter 9 as part of Black History Month. So Joe has got back to Lucy's time. He is really now this time going to have to make a big effort to pretend to be Josiah. So keep up the French accent, really unpleasant, quite rude. Things have changed in Lucy's house since he was here last time because her father brought back her cousin Tobias and his mother, and also these two adult slaves and two children. Black African slaves from the plantation. But we're going to meet them probably this chapter, I expect. Chapter 9. They've just walked into the house. Lucy handed her coat and hat to a maid and sat down to take her boots off. Morley stood silently nearby. Joe gave his hat and coat to the maid as well and straightened his wig. "Would there be some other shoes I could borrow?" he whispered to Lucy. "Mine are very muddy." Lucy looked up. "Morley, could you have Amos bring up a full set of clothes for my cousin and clean his shoes for him? Take your shoes off, Josiah, and I'll take you up to your room." As she led the way towards the stairs, Joe murmured, "I need you to tell me what the different rooms are. Everyone will assume I know this house." Lucy nodded. She began to climb the stairs slowly, waiting until Morley and the maid had gone. Then she stopped and turned round. "My mother's in the parlour," she said, gesturing to the furthest door on the right. "That was where we had tea, remember? The library, where we did painting, is also my father's study. He's working in there, as he often does in the afternoons." She gestured to the door opposite. "And that's the withdrawing room." "What's the door beside the front door?" Joe asked. "That's the powder room, remember, where the water closet is." "Oh, yes. So where's the kitchen?" "The kitchens," Lucy replied, emphasising the S, "are below stairs, with the other rooms the servants use. The laundry is done down there, and other household things." Joe could tell she had no idea what those other things were. "How'd you get to it?" "You don't. But the servants come up through the door next to the powder room. If you need something, ring the bell in whichever room you're in, and a servant will come." She went on up to the first floor. Joe followed, holding tight to the handrail. The polished stairs felt slippery beneath his stockinged feet. "You remember we eat in the dining room up here?" Lucy nodded to the open door ahead of them. "Then this room is Peter's, which is where you'll sleep. We'll come back here in a minute, but I'll quickly show you the rest of the house first. My parents sleep in the largest bedroom, through that door there, with Thomas in his crib. Thomas's nurse, Sarah, used to have the room next door to them, but Tobias is in there now." "What, right now?" She smiled. "No, right now he's probably out. There's no school on Saturday afternoons, and Tobias always goes out, even though my father suggested he might spend the time studying with Miss Waters." She lowered her voice. "Peter says he can barely read or write. It seems that he had hardly any education in the West Indies." She looked suddenly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean, not like you. You could read even though you couldn't write." "Me?" Joe was momentarily baffled. "Oh, you mean with the quill?" He grinned. "I can write perfectly well with the pens we have at home, but I've never had to use a quill, let alone cut one." "What are your pens made of, then?" "Plastic." "What's that?" He shook his head. "It's not worth trying to explain." Lucy looked at him thoughtfully. "But you'd learnt to paint. Does everyone learn where you come from?" "Not everyone, but they teach art in most schools, and it makes no difference whether you're a boy or a girl." "Josiah couldn't paint to save his life." Lucy's eyes danced. "Miss Waters invited him to join our lesson after you'd done so well. You should have seen the mess he made before he stormed out. Miss Waters couldn't understand it. Jo felt a glow of pride mixed with glee. Lucy led the way onwards up the second flight of stairs. On the next landing were 5 normal doors plus a narrower door to one side. There had been a door like this in the same place on the first floor. "What's in there?" he asked. "That's the servants' staircase and the butler's lift." "Morley gets his own lift?" Jo was amazed. "No," Lucy asked. "A butler's lift is for sending food and things up and down between floors. That's what's behind that extra door in the dining room." Jo recalled the dishes appearing. They must have come quite some way from the kitchen. No wonder the food hadn't been very hot. "Miss Waters is in here, if you remember," Lucy was saying, "and the room next door is mine. I used to share it with Anne, but my Aunt Catherine sleeps in with me now. It's not really right for her to have to share, but my mother didn't know where else to put her. Then that one's the nursery, which is also where Sarah sleeps. She had to give up her room to Tobias, which didn't go down well. And Hannah got moved out too, from that one there, to make room for Rose and Billy and their Negro nursemaid, Florence." Lucy paused. "The one next door is Mary, the housekeeper. She's important enough to keep her own bedroom, though it would be much too small for Aunt Catherine anyway. Morley has his own room as well, up in the attics, but the footmen have had to share up there because my father insisted that the new manservant, Amos, should have his own room. That's what I meant about the servants being out of sorts. Most of them have lost their own bit of space, and 6 extra people in the house means a lot more work too." "Don't Amos and Florence do some of the work, though?" Jo asked. "They're servants, aren't they?" "Yes," Lucy said, "but they're having to learn our ways, and they speak a strange kind of English, especially Florence. We don't always understand what she says, nor she us. And even when Amos and Florence are working, our servants resent it. Florence looks after Rose and Billy, and Sarah is afraid my parents will ask her to look after Thomas too, which means she isn't needed anymore." "What about Amos?" "That's not much better," Lucy sighed. "Morley's nose is out of joint because Amos has taken over as my father's personal manservant, and the footmen, Jackson and Metcalfe, loathe him for having forced them to share a room." She gave a wry smile. "They're so full of themselves, with their fancy livery. They think they're a cut above everyone else because they have much less work to do. I don't really know why my father keeps them. All they do is wait at table and ride on the back of the carriage when my parents go out." She giggled. "Do you know what people call footmen?" "What?" "Fart catchers." Jo burst out laughing. "Why?" he spluttered. "Because all they do is stand behind their master at the table or on the carriage as though they're waiting to catch his farts." They both broke into wails of helpless laughter. Downstairs a door opened. "Is that you, Lucy?" Ellen called up the stairwell. Jo clapped his hand over his mouth. "Yes, Mother." Lucy's voice came out as a squeak. She and Jo doubled up again. "Are you all right? You're not crying, are you?" "No, Mother," Lucy called back. "I'm fine." But tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to control herself. The door downstairs closed again. Jo pulled himself together. "What will she think?" "Goodness knows." Lucy wiped her eyes. "There hasn't been much to laugh about round here in a while." Back on the first floor they went into Peter's room. There were 2 beds in here, one of them a 4-poster hung with curtains, the other without posts and stripped of its covers. Jo sat down heavily on this second bed, still weak from laughing. "Amos will bring some clothes for you in a moment," Lucy said, throwing herself down in the chair by the window. All at once Jo remembered Perrault. His merriment ebbed away. "Is Amos a free man now?" he asked, "or is he still a slave?" Lucy looked up, surprised. "I don't know," she said. "Slave or servant doesn't make much difference, does it? My father treats him well, so I think he's happy to be here, even though the other servants give him the cold shoulder." Joe considered this. A bit of unfriendliness would be nothing compared to the harshness of life on the plantation. But still the damp English spring must have come as a shock. Amos and Florence couldn't help but feel alien here. It was hardly home sweet home. And the question of freedom wasn't something you could dismiss just like that, he thought, even though he could see why Lucy might think it made no difference. After all, if the work was the same and you had a good master, why should it matter? If he was free, Amos might choose to stay, but he would be choosing. Joe felt sure that was important. He couldn't imagine being someone else's property, owned like an animal. There was a slight sound from the doorway. A man entered the room, carrying Joe's shoes in one hand and some clothes over the other arm. I'm just going to pause here to say Amos speaks with a strong West Indian accent. Very strong, and so does Florence. I can't do it. I'm not going to try. It would be embarrassing for us both. Okay? So you'll just have to try and imagine that. It's written correctly, but I can't do it. French accent, German accent, fine. West Indian, not in your life. Seeing Joe, the man stopped and bowed. Joe scrambled to his feet and bowed in return. This must be Amos. But except for being black, he was not at all as Joe had imagined him. He gazed at the manservant in astonishment. Unconsciously, he had assumed that Amos would seem old and broken from years of mistreatment. But the man in front of him stood tall and straight. His shoulders were broad, and though he was thinner than he ought to be, his bearing suggested tremendous strength. His eyes were dark pools in a wide, handsome face, and he was immaculately dressed in a tailcoat and breeches with a wig of black hair tied in a ponytail. Joe flushed, mortified to have been caught even thinking about someone owning such an impressive man. But Lucy was unconcerned that Amos might have overheard them talking about him. "How are you today?" she asked him. Amos's handsome face broke into a smile that lit up the room. "I am well, thank you, Lucy. Miss Lucy." He pronounced the words with a heavy accent, but his voice was deep and rich. And you're just going to have to use your imagination for that, sorry. Joe took an involuntary step backwards. No wonder the footman disliked him. They'd been a Weasley pair, bowing and scraping to their mistress. Whereas this man, if a man such as this chose to serve you, it would be a great honour. Yet here was the question again, had he chosen? Watching Amos, Joe knew that his instinct had been right. It did matter, very much. Amos put down the shoes and began to lay out the clothes he'd brought. "Would Master Josiah like help to dress?" he asked. Joe noticed that his tone was suddenly careful. He blushed again. He couldn't ask this man to help him. And yet there might be difficult fastenings on some of these clothes. Before he could answer, Lucy spoke for him. "Thank you, Amos." She turned away to look out of the window. Awkwardly, Joe allowed Amos to help him out of his coat and waistcoat. While Amos untied his cravat, he averted his eyes, but when he sat down on the bed to remove his stockings and Amos knelt to do it for him, Joe flinched. This was not right. It might only be what was expected, but he wasn't the lord of the manor. And even if he were, it was demeaning for a grown man to do such a thing for anyone, especially a man like this one. Nonetheless, he was changed and ready much more quickly than he would have been without help. "Thank you, Amos," he said meekly. "You are welcome, Master Josiah." Amos smiled, and this time warmth shone out towards Joe. "I will ask the maid to make up your bed again." "Thank you." Joe dropped his gaze to the floor. He felt small and humble. "Shall we go up to the nursery and see Thomas?" Lucy suggested. Joe raised his head again. Amos had gone without a sound. The nursery was a bright, pleasant room overlooking the garden. As usual, a fire burned in the grate, though it wasn't all that warm in the room. Cold seemed to be coming from one corner in particular, where a woman sat sewing. This must be Sarah. At her feet a baby played with some wooden bricks. Joe saw Sarah put on a smile as Lucy looked her way, but her eyes were hostile. Lucy crouched down beside the baby. "Hello, Tommy," she said, piling the bricks into a tower. Joe stood uneasily behind her. What would Josiah do? He wouldn't get down on the floor to play, Joe was sure. On the far side of the room, a young black woman sat on the rug with 2 more children. This must be Florence with Rose and Billy. The children were doing a complicated kind of knitting on their fingers. Joe looked at them curiously. They weren't what he thought of as black. At least, they were nowhere near as dark-skinned as Florence or Amos. These children had skin the colour of milky coffee. Florence was singing softly to them, a simple tune with words Joe couldn't understand. "She's like that all day," Sarah said acidly, twittering away like some blooming bird. "Should be teaching them English songs if they're going to stay." "English," she said loudly to Florence. "English." Florence bowed her head and stopped singing. "She'll start up again in a minute, you'll see. You can't shut her up. She's as happy as a pig in muck. An easy life for her it is now. Ought to be sent back to the plantation where she came from. I heard they beat them there if they don't do as they're told," Sarah said with relish. "A good flogging might teach her to keep quiet." Joe looked across at Florence. Her face was turned away from Sarah, but from where he stood he saw an expression of intense pain. Sarah might not think Florence understood, but it was clear that she did. Then again, maybe Sarah knew full well. He waited for Lucy to say something, to tell the nursemaid not to be so nasty, perhaps. But Lucy stayed silent, concentrating fiercely on Tommy's bricks. Deliberately, he crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside Rose and Billy. He didn't look at Sarah. She could think what she wanted, and if Josiah wouldn't have done this, he didn't care either. He took a long piece of wool from the basket beside Florence and watched what the children were doing. "How do you begin?" he asked. Florence reached out and wound the wool around his fingers. Joe heard a sharp intake of breath. In spite of himself, he looked up. Sarah was gaping at Florence's hand touching his. Suddenly he'd had enough. "I can't do this, Lucy," he said. "I can't pretend like this." He was on his feet again. Lucy looked up, alarmed. "If your family can't accept me for who I am, just as you've done, then it's too bad." "But," Lucy began, "you can't just be myself. Why not? Nobody wants Josiah back. Maybe they won't mind having someone else instead." Lucy shot a look at Sarah. The young woman was watching with greedy interest. "Let's go." Lucy stood up hurriedly. "See you later, Tommy." Joe followed her out of the room. Her mouth was set in a thin line. When the door was closed, she shook her head at him. "That was not a good idea," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," Joe said. "I just couldn't stand it. Didn't you hear the way she was talking about Florence in front of her? She's poisonous." "Maybe, but it's nothing to do with us." "It felt like she was assuming we agreed with her." "I think perhaps Josiah did agree," Lucy said. "I know Tobias does. He doesn't trouble to hide it, even in front of my father." "But your father thinks differently." "I'm not sure he knows what to think, but he did bring them back with him. In any case, you saying you're not Josiah in front of her, that could be really tricky." "Only if she tells someone before I do." "But you can't. Really you can't. What did you think—" Lucy broke off. There were footsteps on the stairs coming up towards them. They waited. A head of dark, wavy hair appeared. From beneath it, a young man looked up. Joe felt as though his heart clutched together in spasm. "Ah, Cousin Lucy," Tobias drawled. His gaze flicked across to Joe. "And Josiah, you haven't left us after all." His eyebrows lifted. His smile was one of genuine pleasure. It made his face quite handsome. Joe's pulse raced. For the first time since he'd met Hannah, here was someone who was truly pleased to see him. But it was the last person in the world he wanted to please. He bowed. "Tobias," he said, "as you see..." Just in time he remembered the French accent. He straightened up and made himself smile back. "As you see, I am still here." So there we are. The connection to Black History Month becomes more apparent, I think, and it will become more apparent still. So, back here tomorrow, same time, for Chapter 10. Yes, Chapter 10. All right, I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.